Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you all here this evening for a very special presentation, a launch really of our Irish High Crosses exhibition, the replicas that have been in the National Museum in hiding and storage for the last 20 or 30 years, since they were locked away by Dr. Raftery and then consigned to Dangan Reformatory, but thankfully resurrected by the OPW and ourselves for Nagoya, for the exhibition there, for the Expo exhibition in 05-06, and now here at Collins Barracks in a special exhibition. So the living expert is Peter Harbison, Dr. Peter Harbison, who has written so well and so extensively about the crosses that he's the obvious person to speak about this and to launch this show.
Okay, Pat, you mentioned the high crosses when they were in the museum. It saddened me, as someone who was interested in high crosses, when they were removed in the late 1970s. And thank heavens they have been brought back here. It was a wonderful idea to go and bring the crosses back here to Dublin and actually put them up so that we can see what the 2 million, in fact, Japanese saw a couple of years ago. Now, what were the high crosses all about? And how did they come about? First of all, let me just say the word high cross itself. It occurs twice in the old Irish annals in the 960s and again in 1060. And it merely just refers to a high cross. It calls it Ard Crish. And when you look at this wonderful cross here from Monaster Boyce at the center of the exhibition, you will realize why they were given that name, because they are up to 20 and more feet high. This one is the tallest high cross in the country at about, as I say, it's about 21 to 22 feet high. Now, the high crosses are really one of the, I would say that they are Ireland's greatest contribution to the sculpture of Europe during the medieval period. Europe has nothing to compare with what we have here in Ireland. We were not the first to go and make stone high crosses. The English started making them probably already in the 7th century, and it took us a century and more to go and, if you like, catch up with them. But on the other hand, what differentiates the Irish high crosses from the English high crosses is the richness of the sculpture, which the panels which you can see on the two crosses on either side of me, which illustrate scenes from the Old and the New Testaments. And we have a much richer iconography than any of the crosses in these islands. The only comparable iconography that you will find is in the frescoes on churches on the continent of Europe. One of the most unusual features and really unexpected features, though simply as we know high crosses, we don't really realize just how unique it is the way in which the various different biblical scenes are, as it were, attached to the form of the cross. This is something which is virtually unique in Europe. The only other example I can get is a small little cross in the Vatican dating from the reign of Pope Eugene I from 817 to 824. But coming back to the crosses in general, you realize that, as I say, that they are absolutely monumental. They suddenly hit the scene, and you say to yourself, right, okay, what is the purpose of these crosses? I think, like everything in this country, there is no one single solution. I think there are probably various different reasons. If you look at the Ahene crosses, you will notice that on them there is no figure sculpture at all. And if they were copied from metal crosses of the kind, to a certain extent, that you see in the Cross of Cong, which is about 3 or 4 centuries later, which is in the National Museum in Kildare Street, that these two may have been modelled on crosses which may have been either processional crosses or possibly even crosses which stood on altars. But it's something different when you come to the scripture crosses of the kind that you have on my right, on my left, which come from the site at Monaster Boyce in County Louth, only a couple of miles from north of Drogheda. And you see there various different panels showing you scenes from the Old and the New Testament. And obviously they were there in order to go and tell the Bible story, both Old and New Testament, to what was probably a largely unlettered and unread public who wouldn't necessarily have been able to read the Gospels. It would have been mainly your monks who would have been able to read the Gospels, but the general folk probably wouldn't necessarily have been able to read the Gospels at the time. And this was an effort, if I can use the phrase, to almost have an early comic. If you look at the panels, they're almost like the comics, the children's comics that you see, you probably still see, divided up into little panels and so on. And this is an effort to try to show you scenes from the Old and the New Testament. But they weren't just comics, as I say. They weren't just there to go and tell the story, because you don't get everything from the Old Testament and the New Testament. You get a specific selection. And that selection usually was made in order to go and point to some particular dogma or something of the church. We have made great strides within the last 20 years in the dating of the crosses through the decipherment of some of the inscriptions on some of the crosses, inscriptions which in a number of cases were not easy to read. There is one inscription here on the cross behind me, the cross of Muireadach, and it's known as the cross of Muireadach because there is an inscription which says Or the Muireadach las Nirnad in Chrossa Sha, a prayer for Muireadach who made this cross. But there are two Muireadach abbots of Monaster Boyce who could have been involved in making the cross. But on the other hand, it doesn't have to have been an abbot who was the Muireadach, whose name is on the cross. It could well have been a local king or something like that. And this is one of the things that is really coming across as very interesting and very novel in the study of high crosses within the last 20 years, is the involvement of politics in the erection of these crosses. You think of these crosses as something which are purely religious because it has a cross shape and it has scenes from the Old and New Testament. But on the cross of the scriptures in Clonmacnoise and on a cross in Castle Bernard in County Offaly and another one in Durrow, you are finding inscriptions which are referring to two high kings of Ireland, a father and a son. One of them is Mael Trochlin, the first who reigned from 846 to 862, and the other is Flann Sinna, who reigned from 879 to 916. And I think it is within the reigns of those two kings that we have to now place most of the crosses, even those which don't actually have inscriptions. So, as I say, they fit best into the 9th century, into the 9th century, and I think probably the third quarter or the last third of the 9th century is the time that we can probably place the high crosses in. That is a time, after all, where you had one of the greatest Irishmen of all time, Johannes Scotus Erugina, who had gone to the continent and who flabbergasted the court of Charlemagne's sons with his knowledge of Greek. And they said, this man coming from this island out there, how can he possibly know Greek? But he did know Greek, and he was able to show how much more Greek he knew than almost anyone else at the king's court in Soissons. So it's a time when Ireland was absolutely flourishing. And if you see the crosses as being of the same time as Johannes Scotus, you will realise that Ireland was going through a really blossoming period at the time. So, and one of the other interesting features is that if you look at things like the Book of Kells, you will see that the figures on the Book of Kells, they're all they're represented in a very stylized way. But the figures that you have on the high crosses, they are not stylized. They are shown as you would have, as not a Greek, but a Roman sculptor would probably have shown them. And obviously the sculptors who are sculpting the figures on the high crosses are modeling themselves on a sculpture which must once have existed in an area on the continent where the idea of classical sculpture was still preserved. And that must have been somewhere the empire of Charlemagne in Aachen and beyond that. So again, I think Ireland is benefiting from its contacts with the continent and also seems to have been well in with the courts of the various different kings on the continent. But this is not to say that everything that you see on the high crosses is continental. Not at all. The great genius of these high crosses is the way in which the Irish have been able to combine what they got from the continent in the shape of the iconographical scenes with the idea of a cross decorated with metalwork patterns, geometric patterns of one sort or another, which are purely Irish and which you will see in manuscripts such as the Book of Durrow and the Book of Kells. So as I say, the Irish genius is in fact for moulding the cross into a wonderful unit which has a whole lot of different elements in it. And these crosses, therefore, they are something absolutely unique. They are, as I go back to what I said earlier, they are Ireland's greatest contribution to the sculpture of Europe at the time in the early medieval period. Now, when you look at these crosses, the Irish, as I said to you, were not necessarily the ones who invented the cross, but they were certainly the ones who almost patented the idea of the stone cross with a ring. And you say to yourself, okay, what about the ring? It's called the Celtic cross, I suspect, because it's mainly used in the countries where Celtic languages are spoken, such as Ireland and Scotland. But what of the ring? If you look at most of the crosses, you will see that the Irish crosses, that the arms of the crosses are not straight. Above and below, they usually have a little notch in them. And if you imagine the cross without the ring, you would realize that the ends of the arms are very heavy. And because of the notch, there would be an awful danger of the ends of the crosses just quite simply snapping off. And there are one or two cases known where, in fact, this has happened. So you can say that the ring has, in fact, a purely structural use in keeping the arms upright. And obviously, if you'd had something underneath in the shape of a half a ring to go and keep the arms upright, that wouldn't look quite right. So you put the ring around the whole thing to make it look visually attractive. But I think that there is something more to it than that. I mentioned earlier that there is no one simple solution to things in this country. If you look at the crosses, most of the crosses, and particularly the two that you're seeing here behind me from Monaster Boyce, you will realize that at the center of the cross is the crucifixion, the figure of the crucified Christ. Now, for early Christians, the crucifixion was literally the most crucial, the most central event in the whole history of the universe. And I think we must therefore look at the ring as being a symbol of the cosmos, so that the ring therefore becomes what could be described as a cosmic symbol. And at the center of that cosmic symbol, at the center of the whole universe, is the crucifixion of Christ. And that was really the central point that these crosses were making. They were making us look at the crucifixion and reflect on the crucifixion, on the passion, and various different things that lead up to it. And sometimes you find on the crosses at the very bottom of one side, as on the other side of Murdoch's cross here, you find a figure of Adam and Eve. And after all, it was their original sin which made Christ give his life on the cross for us. So you've got, if you like, a whole chain of events which start off at the beginning of the book of Genesis, leading up to Christ giving his life for mankind on the cross. And look at the crucifixion on the Irish high crosses here. There are a number of interesting features. One of the most interesting of which is that if you look at it, which side is Christ being pierced in? Normally, if you go into a church nowadays, you will see the figure of the crucified Christ with a wound on his right side. But there is no biblical explanation for that. None of the Gospels tells you on which side Christ's side was pierced. And the Irish, with very few exceptions, the Irish, both in manuscripts and on the high crosses, show Christ's left side being pierced. And that is what you find up here. If you look, you will see that Longinus with his lance is piercing under the arm of Christ rather than the right-hand side. And that makes a lot of sense, because if they wanted to prove that Christ was dead, obviously they would put the spear through his heart, which is on the left side. So I think the Irish were following their heart and their head, if you like, in putting the spear, or the spear holder, on the left-hand side of Christ rather than on the right. Now, I don't want to be going on too long, but I just want to say to you that there are two different chronological groups of crosses. And as far as I'm concerned, All but one of the crosses shown here belong to the earlier group. You've got the two Aheny crosses, you've got the two Monaster Boys crosses, and this one here from Drumcliff in County Sligo, which is quite often put in the 11th century, but I believe it can fit in quite happily into the 9th century as well. And finally, let me just point out two things to you, because it's interesting comparing these crosses here, above all, with the Drumcliff and with the Dyson O'Dea cross. All of these crosses form a unit. But look, go back to the animal decoration on the cross of Dyson O'Dea, and you will see that above the three panels of animal ornament, there is suddenly a different kind of ornament. The reason, quite simply, for that is that the head of the cross was not originally designed for the shaft. And the two pieces of two crosses have been mounted one on top of the other. And exactly the same is true of the cross here in Drumcliff. If you look carefully, you will see that the upper part does not fit into the lower part. In fact, the little beading on the lower part has purposely been fitted in to go. The beading goes in near the top in order to go and fit in with the upper part. So the upper part is the older one, and there was originally another part of the cross, the shaft, which has since disappeared. So what you have here are two instances of pieces of crosses which have been put one on top of the other. And if you go up to the north of Ireland, that is what you find in almost all cases. You have crosses which are two crosses put one on top of the other. And that comes from the iconoclasm of the 17th century, having bashed a number of the crosses. There must have been many, many more than there were now. But we are lucky to go and have the crosses, in fact, that we do have. But we are also lucky in having this exhibition here. And I think all of you will probably agree with me when I say that when you come around at the back and you suddenly come into this room in total darkness, that there is an absolute wow effect, because there you can see the crosses, again in this totally dark room, suddenly they are lit up in a way that you will never actually see them on site. One of the beautiful things about this exhibition is the way the lighting brings out the details on these crosses. Details that you will not easily see, particularly on the north side of the crosses, where the sun would only shine in the very early morning or late in the evening of a high summer day. And so the light is bringing out details, as I say, that you won't normally see. And I must say, I was looking at one of the crosses, one of the Aheny crosses here earlier on, about an hour ago, and suddenly I saw a detail that I hadn't actually seen before. I realized there were two lions facing one another, and you could see that they were lions because their tails were kind of in an S shape, and I hadn't actually noticed that detail before. So I am grateful to the National Museum for having shown me this particular detail on these crosses. Now, the crosses were the molds for these crosses were made from the actual originals about 100 years ago under the direction of Count Plunkett, who was the director of the museum at the time. And if you look over here, you will see that there is preserved in this case some of the original molds that were used to go and make the plaster casts that we are looking at in this room today. And it's worthwhile looking at them and seeing the care that was taken in making the molds. And it's interesting that it's the 150th anniversary of the first book that was produced on the subject of high crosses, which was Henry O'Neill's book on high crosses. And he very cleverly, in his book, he took some of the panels on this side of Murdoch's cross and he painted them. And he noticed in painting them that if you followed the course of the individual interlaces, that there were 3 sets of interlace. And you could only see that if you coloured each one separately. And he came to the conclusion at the time that therefore the crosses must have been coloured. Now, there's not a trace of colour surviving on any of the crosses. But I think something like that, as Henry O'Neill showed us 150 years ago, we must imagine the high crosses as having been painted originally. As I say, when you come around the bend, you say, wow. And this is really a wow exhibition as far as I'm concerned. So congratulations to all, to the National Museum, to the Office of Public Works and so on, for having presented this. And I can only hope that what I've been saying to you over the last, half an hour or so, in fact, will give you an appreciation of the absolutely wonderful nature, the majestic nature, the nobility of these great high crosses, which, as I say, are Ireland's greatest contribution to the sculpture of early medieval Europe. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.